great machine, of course, but I think the celebration is not only of this fine instrument, but also of the men and women who... Louder yet? Okay, I will shout if you don't mind. I can shout, all right. So it's also a celebration of the men and women who did such fantastic science to establish our place in the universe with this telescope. And we have a series of speakers, and the first one I'd like to introduce is Jeff Vale from the U.S. Forest Service. Jeff is the superintendent of the Los Angeles National Forest, the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument, and he's worked for the Department of Agriculture for 25 years. And I have to thank him and his men. They literally have saved this mountaintop twice in my experience. We had a fire less than a month ago, a few weeks ago, right at our doorstep, and his crew ably and competently put it out, and we still have their trucks here on standby, so I want to thank him.
So first of all, I'd like to congratulate everybody involved with the Mount Wilson Institute and the Carnegie Institute, and to acknowledge that this history of 100 years is a shared history. It's one that the Forest Service has been proud to be a part of. I would note that 125 years ago, this year, the San Gabriel Forest Reserve was established. So we too are celebrating our history, and we acknowledge that we have a story to tell that is mutual. And we're happy to be here. We're happy to be a part of your history, and we look forward to a future together. I do think that as we look at the present, as Tom indicated, we come together every time that we need to. When there's a crisis like a fire start 2 weeks ago, we're here working overtime, and your staff has been supportive of us just as we have been to you. So we're proud of that relationship, and we want it to continue. The connection between earth and sky is something that we pay close attention to every time a weather shift happens or Santa Ana winds kick up. And so what we look at here today in observing outer space and what we've learned, what you've learned and brought to the world, is something that continues to influence and shape how we work with the public and how we approach our mission. I think we do have an opportunity going forward to share this history and the knowledge about how science and technology continue to grow and evolve, that we can tell that story to the 17 million people that live within a 90-minute drive of this forest. And so I do look forward to engaging with you and exploring some ideas on how we can work together as partners in the future. So again, congratulations to everybody affiliated with this fantastic observatory, and we look forward to the next 100 years of partnership together. Thank you.
Loud enough, all right. I'd like to bring up now Mr. Sam Hale, grandson of George L. Ray Hale.
Thank you, Tom. Tom didn't, well, first of all, as Tom said, my name is Sam Hale. I am the chief of the Board of Trustees of the Mount Wilson Institute. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight, and it's also a great pleasure to have my brother, Bragg Hale, here, who knew our grandfather and will share a few thoughts at the conclusion of these remarks. I also want to thank the people who made this possible, starting with the Carnegie Institution, with John Mulcahy, who is continually wonderfully supportive to our efforts here, to Erica Clark, who helped him out in this endeavor of putting this together on our board. And I'm going to mention one person on our board, but there are so many that I'd be up here all night thanking them all for the efforts that they made, and that's Dan Coney. We're here to celebrate one of the salient moments in in the history of science. It happened 100 years ago, November the 1st, 1917. A clear, dark night on this mountaintop. A small group of men gathered in this dome, the very dome we are sitting in this evening. One of those men was my grandfather, George Ellery Hale. They were here to test what would become the most revolutionary telescope in the history of the world, the Hooker 100-inch reflecting telescope that stands before us. At the suggestion of Andrew Carnegie, it was named after Los Angeles businessman who had funded the mirror, John Hooker. The evening was the culmination of nearly 20 years of dreaming, planning, persuading, and just plain old hard work by my grandfather, along with the combined efforts of a team of skilled scientists and technicians under his direction. Hale, along with Walter Adams, the Observatory's assistant director, climbed the stairs to the observing platform. The giant telescope gracefully slewed across the sky and focused on brilliant Jupiter. My grandfather looked through the eyepiece for several seconds. He said nothing. He stepped back, glancing at Adams with grim concern. Adams stepped forward and looked through the eyepiece. Adams also stepped back, saying nothing. Their stunned silence told the others the distressing news. Instead of a single, bright, spectacular image of Jupiter, they had seen several overlapping, distorted images. The telescope's optic appeared flawed, to be seriously flawed. Hale and Adams were distraught. But then someone mentioned that workmen had left the dome open during the day. But then the bright sun had shone on the telescope, possibly it was possible that the sun's heat had distorted the mirror. In time, the mirror might cool and the telescope work properly. That was their best hope. Anxious and restless, they milled around the dome floor for another hour or two, looking through the eyepiece from time to time. The image improved, but not by a lot. They decided to give the silvered 100-inch mirror several more hours to cool. They left the dome and started walking through the dark night. As the group slowly made its way back to the monastery to try to catch some sleep, George Ellery Hale must have been a deeply troubled man. Years of plans and hopes were in peril. The enormous trust placed on him by the Carnegie Institution, John Hooker, and the scientists and technicians who worked on the mountain now seemed betrayed. But to my grandfather, the greatest concern of all was that his prized new scientific instrument, designed to dramatically expand our knowledge of the universe, could be a colossal failure. At the very least, it would probably need major repair, and that meant our progress in understanding the cosmos could be slowed for decades. My grandfather's ultimate goal in life was never personal glory. It was always to push the frontiers of science. This was his driving passion, and now it seemed threatened. At the monastery, Hale lay down, but could not sleep. To pass the time, he tried to read a detective story, but he couldn't finish it. We can only imagine the torment and anxiety that he felt. Finally, around 2:30 in the morning, Hale made the 8-minute walk back to the 100-inch dome. Walter Adams and the others of the party soon joined him. They climbed the stairs to the dome floor. Hale and Adams continued up to the observing platform. The giant telescope swung again to a new target. Jupiter was no longer observable. Instead, the giant silvered mirror was focused on one of the brighter stars in the night sky. Once again, consumed by a mixture of dread and hope, Hale peered into the eyepiece. He shouted in triumph. There was the star, a bright, crisp point of light. The mirror had cooled, and the telescope was working as designed. The 100-inch reflector had seen first light, and our view of the cosmos was about to change forever, growing bigger, clearer, and more exhilarating than ever before. Hale had invited Alfred Noyes, the British poet, to spend this historic night with the staff in the observatory. That was my grandfather's touch. He was a visionary scientist who deeply appreciated the music of the stars and the poetry of creation. So he had invited a poet to join him for the first night. Earlier in the evening, Hale had said to Noyes, "You poets write of many things, but you never write of the development of science in the modern world. You write of wars. Why don't you write instead of the fight for knowledge?" Noyes was up to the challenge. 5 years later, he commemorated his time on Mount Wilson and the progress of astronomy in his book of poetry, Watchers of the Sky. He spoke of the courage and vision of George Ellery Hale and those who helped Hale develop his great telescope. For more than 20 years, wrote Noyes, they had thought and planned and worked. Where was the gambler that would stake so much? Time, patience, treasure on a single throw. The cost of it, they'd not find that again, either in gold or life stuff. All their youth was fuel to the flame of this one work. Noyes had captured the moment. The stakes had been high. The payoff would be spectacular. A bit later that night, Hale returned to the monastery, this time a happy man. As he went to bed that night, I doubt he spent much time dwelling on the evening's success. I know how my grandfather thought. I bet he was already starting to dream about an even bigger, better telescope. A telescope that he would champion but never lived to see completed. A telescope that 30 years later would become a powerful new tool on Palomar Mountain. The state-of-the-art instrument would ultimately be named in honor of my grandfather, the Hale 200-inch reflecting telescope. As we know, Galileo was the first on a quest that helped us escape the magic and superstition of the past, following on the revelations of Copernicus. It was on Mount Wilson in the early 20th century that the second Copernican revolution unfolded. 200 yards to our south, on the 60-inch reflecting telescope, Shapley's insight helped us to understand that Earth is really on a remote edge, not in the center of the Milky Way. The discovery of a possible infinite universe awaited another door to open. My grandfather postulated in a 1928 article in Harper's Magazine that Einstein's original theory that we did not dwell in a static universe could only be proved by a large telescope. Hubble and Hummelson soon validated that assertion, where we now stand. Like we do today, Einstein visited this temple of science in 1931 for the same reason we do today, to possibly glimpse our origins in the expanding celestial dome that the Hooker telescope helped us to explore. We all come to this place and also sense what Einstein realized, that this is the magic that resides here. I know you trustees of Carnegie who are with us tonight feel great pride in the legacy that remains the cornerstone of your institution. As we have for 30 years, the Mount Wilson Institute has been keeping that flame. We will continue to do so, standing on the shoulders of Galileo, Einstein, and George Ellery Hale. Today, it is more than appropriate for all of us to join together in this historic building to celebrate that remarkable occasion 100 years ago, November the 1st, 1917, the night that changed the cosmos. Thank you.
I'd like to call up Dr. Cindy Hunt from Carnegie Observatories to introduce our next speaker.
All right, good evening. I'm Dr. Cindy Hunt, and if you haven't met me before, I'm an astronomer, but I also help tell the narrative stories from the Carnegie Institution for Science. Tonight, in my role as chair of the History Committee of the Carnegie Observatories, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, acclaimed author Daly Sobel. Sobel is a rare talent whose writing is beloved by scientists and non-scientists alike. She deftly turns complex scientific topics into compelling stories, often by focusing on a field's unsung heroes. In particular, Sobel frequently brings to light the roles women have played in the history of science. Stories that were often overlooked but should never be forgotten. This topic is near and dear to my heart, and I hope the stories she tells will continue to inspire the next generations of young scientists and scientist enthusiasts from all walks of life. And as Deva already knows, I'm probably her biggest fangirl. A former staff writer at the New York Times, Sobel's articles have also appeared in the New Yorker, Discover, Life, Omni, and Audubon, among other publications. Deva is also a best-selling author of several books about scientific history. Her works include Pulitzer Prize finalist Galileo's Daughter and British Book of the Year winner Longitude, as well as The Planets. Her latest, The Glass Universe, How the Ladies of the Harvard Observatory Took Measure of the Stars, is particularly relevant to our focus tonight on the rich history of American astronomy. Her writing has been recognized with awards from the National Science Board, the Bradford Washburn Award, the Harrison Medal, the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, among others. But perhaps my favorite recognition for her astronomical contributions to the history of science is the asteroid 30935 Daly Sobel. Discovered at the Palomar Observatory about 150 miles south of us, we can look at it with our own telescopes at about 2:49 tomorrow morning. That is, if we're not too exhausted after tonight's festivities. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in offering your warmest welcome to Daly Sobel.
Yes, I'll stand aside because I probably can't see over. Okay, you can't see me over. So I am very honored to be included in this program and wanted to look back even before 100 years ago to when George Ellery Hale was an MIT student and got to know Edward Pickering at the Harvard College Observatory. And they were very much kindred spirits, both men of tremendous vision who were captivated by the field of spectroscopy. And Pickering was busy figuring out a way to photograph the spectra of the stars, and Hale was most interested in the sun at that time, but part of the reason he wanted this wonderful instrument was to be able to go to the spectra of not only the stars, but the nebulae. And he was a volunteer assistant at Harvard, and their friendship continued over many years, some of the people who were crucial in funding the work at Harvard, especially Anna Palmer Draper and Catherine Wolfe Bruce, played a part in Hale's later career. He was a winner of both the Draper Medal and the Bruce Medal, set up by those female philanthropists. And when he started his journal, the Astrophysical Journal, that was also Hale's creation. And it was Miss Bruce who gave him the money to get it going. And Hale really could bring people together. It was his vision to have a national group of astronomers, what we now call the American Astronomical Society, really began with him. And he worked with Pickering to write its first constitution. And then it was again Hale who brought together the international group of people interested in the sun to have an international union of solar astronomers, which became the International Astronomical Union. So there were lifelong ties between Hale and Harvard back east. And then it was one of Pickering's hires, Henrietta Swan Leavitt, who made the discovery of the relationship between the period and the brightness of the Cepheid variable stars, something that both Shapley and Hubble used to make their great contributions. And Miss Leavitt's observation, which has been called the period luminosity relation for these many years, but for about the past 10, there's been a movement to call it the Leavitt law. And I encourage all of you to speak of it that way, if you have occasion to speak of it at all. I don't think many of you probably do. There are photographs of Annie Jump Cannon on this mountain, on horseback. She was here. Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin visited Mount Wilson, and who can forget that Hubble called her the best man at Harvard. So may all of that rich foundation continue to enrich us all. And again, thank you for including me tonight.
I have, well, on a personal note here, we have been assisted a great deal by Carnegie in terms of them providing space for us in their offices in Pasadena. It's been a great collaboration. We've started an education program, a STEM program, which we employ or utilize their astronomers in this program, and it's turning out to be a very successful, very interesting program, and we love it, and the teachers, and we have some here who have benefited from this program, we hope, and we enjoy doing it for them. So I'd like to bring up Dr. John Mulcahy from Carnegie Observatory.
Good evening. Oh, that's weird. Hear your voice that way. It's a real thrill for me to be here tonight and to have all of you here joining us to celebrate the amazing 100-inch telescope. Whenever I give a talk about Carnegie astronomy on Mount Wilson, I always say that this is the most important telescope built in the modern era. So I think people should really understand that and appreciate that. This telescope was responsible for the two most important results in astronomy in the last 400 years. Think about that, it's pretty impressive. The first of these was, of course, Hubble's discovery of galaxies, or I like to say the discovery of the universe as we know it. Hubble, when he measured the distance to Andromeda, he showed that there were other stellar systems like the Milky Way. overnight, we went from living in the only stellar system in the universe to living in one of billions. I mean, that's really, think about that. That's a really revolutionary idea. I think it's as important as the work that Copernicus and Galileo did 400 years earlier. So, if that wasn't enough, Hubble, of course, 5 years later, thanks to the work of Milton Hummelson, I have to point out, Milton Hummelson, we have his granddaughter and here today, and other relatives. Milton Hummelson was almost certainly the best astronomer to ever use this telescope. People will know Milton's story. He started as a mule driver to Mount Wilson. But in the end, he was extremely careful. And he could do observations that Edwin Hubble could never do. Hubble gets enough attention, so let's give Milton a little. Taking those spectra that Milton Hummelson took on this telescope over many nights in some cases, Edwin Hubble found the evidence that the universe was expanding. So as if discovering the universe was not big enough, he had to go on and show that it was in fact expanding. And if you think about an expanding universe, and you trace it back in time, it implied the universe had a beginning. And that's a truly revolutionary idea. Those two results happened because of this telescope. And they happened, really, these are all of modern astronomy kind of got launched from these two discoveries. Now, although this is the telescope that made Edwin Hubble famous, we have to give George Ellery Hale his shout out, because it was Hale's vision to build this telescope. Hale was the person who understood that you build bigger telescopes. And you build bigger telescopes not for the things you know they're going to do, but for the things you don't know they're going to do. So I can guarantee you, Hale would have been completely surprised by Hubble's results, in some sense, but he also knew that was the reason he built this telescope. And so we have to give him a shout out for that. And I guess what I'd like to say is, although the legacy of this telescope is often these two results that Hubble had, I think the real legacy is that it launched modern astrophysics. That the questions that we're asking and trying to answer today were started because of this telescope. And so in some sense, the legacy of this telescope is continuing to build with the work that we're still doing. And that's all I wanted to say tonight, so thank you.
Well, I think that a fitting chapter to the talks is some thoughts from my brother William Brackenridge Hale, known as Brack. I think I can rightly say the only person in this room that knew George Ellery Hale personally. So what more credentials do you need than that?
young enough to be here at the 100th to sort of a crusty astronomer. He was hardly any of that. My first memory of him was my older brother George and I would, every Sunday, my parents would dust us off and walk us across the lawn to have lunch with them at 7:39. God, you might hear me. But anyhow, the four of us, my mother, father, and George and myself, would walk across the lawn and over to eat. My grandmother thought she was, sort of a Julia Child and the Scofier all rolled into one, which was very, very inaccurate. But we would have a great hunk of roast beef for lunch, and which my mother, who was a phenomenal cook, sort of took exception to. But anyhow, by the way, there, he would always put me on his knee, and he would bounce me on his knee, and he would sing great areas like poor old Julius Caesar froze his feet in an ice cream freezer. That's pretty heady stuff coming from the man with my grandfather's abilities. But anyhow, that after lunch, then he would load us into his 5-window Ford coupe, and we would go off to the lab being over on Everybody hear me? Anyhow, then we would go to the lab being his sort of hideout on the Holiday Road, about equidistant from Huntington Library and Caltech. And we would go over there. George and I were both scared to death of the place. I was only about 5 or 6, and George was 8 or 9. And we'd get in that, we'd walk in, and then we'd have to go down to the bowels of the place. It was dark and cold and miserable down there, and it just scared the crap out of us. But on the other hand, we'd go up on the top, and that was kind of revealing and kind of enjoyable. But anyhow, more importantly, I'd like to talk a minute about his associates, because I think his associates were the making of the man. His number one associate, we've heard slightly, a small amount already, was Walter S. Adams, who was one of the nicest human beings I've ever known. He was I don't demean him with this, but he was my grandfather's Tonto to my grandfather's Lone Ranger. And he was always with him, and it was his absolute backup. He became the director here after my grandfather's retirement and death. So anyhow, I have nothing but regards, and I don't think anybody who ever knew Walter Adams didn't think he was great. We were fortunate enough to have one of his sons live across the street from us, Edmund, and his brother John also lived in Pasadena. And Edmund and Sam and I got to know each other quite well, and so a wonderful guy was he. But anyhow, he was terrific. The other people that you would never have heard of, one was a guy by the name of Alec Gardner. Now, Alec Gardner was my grandfather's caretaker. He was one tough hombre. And he, on his mantle, there was a picture of him. He was a World War I sergeant major in the Marine Corps. And he had this picture of him in his full dress canvas. Very impressive, very impressive. But again, George and I were pretty much afraid of him, but he took anyhow, that he had 2 kids, but he had a wife, more importantly, who was just a delight. I know Sam has nothing but good feelings about Nell Gardner, and she was a delight. But anyhow, he had 2 children. He had Marshall, a.k.a. Doc, who turned out to be went to Georgia Tech and was a hell of an engineer. But he also spent his time, when my grandfather was walking around, he would follow him around like a puppy. And Doc told me, he said, following your grandfather around was the most exciting, rewarding experience of my life. I learned more from him as a kid than anywhere else that I can imagine. Then he had another employee by the name of Leo Regan. Now, Leo Regan is probably not known by any of you, as you know, probably wasn't Alec Gardner. But Leo Regan was my grandmother's chauffeur. And more than that, he was a brilliant machinist. And I don't know how, I'm sure he ended up as my grandparents' employee because he was president and couldn't afford other jobs. But he was brilliant. So he when my grandfather died and the war started, he formed his own machinist company in South Pasadena, and he became highly successful, and I think ended up a millionaire. But one of the nicest human beings I've ever known, or George ever knew. He was just a delight. Then from there on, I would like to jump to Robert Mulligan. Now, a lot of people have heard of him here. Maybe some of you heard of him. That Mulligan and my grandfather were very closely tied. Now, there's a lot of gossip or whatever and incorrect information that my grandfather was jealous of him. Not in the slightest. My Mulligan admittedly had a major ego, and he took credit for most everything that happened at Caltech. Anyhow, he did a hell of a good job. I mean, he's a darn good president. And the other so-called third founder was Dr. Noyes, who I never knew, but I sure knew Mulligan. Not only did I know the Mulligan, that era of the Mulligan family, but I knew Clark Mulligan, who was his son. He was a well-known, very, very famous aeronautic engineer at Caltech, and a real hot dog. He drove around in a Lincoln Zephyr, and he had a cigarette holder like Franklin Roosevelt, and he was as handsome as a movie star, and just a delightful guy. And he had 2 children. One, Bob Mulligan, the third, or whatever you want to call him, who I went to Polytechnic school with in the 1st grade together, and we remained friends for 20 years until he tragically was killed in the early 50s by stepping in a tunnel of water that was electrified and killed him out here at the Rose Bowl. Terrible thing. And then Michael, who was his other son, is also a great friend. And I remember walking down the street in Newport Beach, Balboa, and I was walking my dog down there, and the garage was open, and lo and behold, inside was Michael Mulligan. So we went in, and this was about midnight, and we finished. Finally, I got out of there at about 4 a.m., both of us stiff as billy goats, because we had a large supply of bourbon. We sat around and talked, and he's a fun guy, and I said he's also, gone. But anyhow, he was wonderful, and we wish you were here, because you would have loved to have been here. Then we have another relative that we haven't talked about, and I'd like to talk very briefly about it. I think some of you are aware, probably all of you are aware that there's a documentary movie made by my friend and dear friend Todd Mason. Todd and his late wife Robin Mason made this documentary, which is just terrific. And anybody who hasn't seen it, I do hope they will see it because it was really good. And unfortunately, Robin died. But fortunately, we built a plaque for her out in front of this building, and to thank her for her wonderful, wonderful work in my grandfather's behalf. They know more about my grandfather than Sam and I and everybody else in this room put together. And maybe it's embarrassing, but maybe not. But anyhow, they were absolutely wonderful to us. And fortunately, I'm running out of stuff here. But there's one thing that I think is kind of funny, but my warped sense of humor. My grandfather sadly died at Los Encinas in, I'm done now. Well, anyhow, wrapping this up, fortunately, that my grandfather died at Los Encinas, and one of his co-patients was W.C. Fields. And I've often wondered if they ever had any conversations. And obviously there's no record of it, at least Todd never told me if there was. But the only thing that I hope that they probably didn't talk about was astrophysics. And I hope desperately they talked about Mae West.
I'd like to invite District Representative Vickery Murphy from State Senator Anthony J. Portantino. I almost did it. Are you still here? I don't see her. Looking for, oh, here she is. Thank you.
I don't think it really works to just hold it, but I'll give a try. Is that okay? I am really glad to be here tonight to just very briefly congratulate you guys and Sam for the 100th anniversary of this great piece here on behalf of Senator Portantino, who really wishes that he could be here, and he is incredibly honored that Mount Wilson is in our Senate district, which we think is the best one of all, because we have Mount Wilson, for instance, and Caltech, and a lot of great other things like that. So we have, or I have with me a certificate of recognition, and Sam, can you come up here? So I'll just show it to you real quick, and then Sam, I'm just going to read this to you first, and then we can just stand for the camera for a minute. It says, presented to the Mount Wilson Observatory in recognition of the 100-inch telescope Centennial. On behalf of the California State Senate, I congratulate you on the historic 100th anniversary of first light at the famous 100-inch Hooker telescope used to transform our understanding of our place in the universe. I join you in recognizing the dedicated men and women who used the telescope's revolutionary light-gathering technology to make groundbreaking astronomical discoveries, from measuring the size of the Milky Way to Hubble and the Hummerson's discovery that the universe is expanding. Dated November 1st, 2017, not 1917, at Mount Wilson, and it's signed Anthony J. Portantino, Senator for the 25th District.
I just have to say in closing that the Mount Wilson Institute, representing the Mount Wilson Observatory, would not be here today if it wasn't for the incredible efforts of everybody who works here, volunteers here, gives their lives here for this place. Starting with Tom, executive director. And our board of trustees, I've already mentioned Dan Coney, and I won't go through all of the trustees because everybody works so hard. The volunteers who make this place tick. This is all volunteer. We have 3 paid staff on this mountain who work incredibly hard. Fabulous. Led by Superintendent Maggie Moran. Maggie, stand up. Everything that's been said tonight in this honor and all of the wonderful support we have for Carnegie, and I thank you in the name of all of these wonderful people who work with me to keep the doors open here and my grandfather's legacy moving forward. Thank you.
We had planned some observing tonight, but it's still 100% humidity. Beg your pardon, Christian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I bet you all thought you were going to be getting out of here back to your warm homes, but there's one last presentation. My name is Christian Daly. I am the Assistant Field Deputy of LA County Supervisor Captain Barger, and it's an honor for me to be here on her behalf tonight. As I sat in my seat, we have the Hale brothers here, and it's befitting that we also have a poet in the house, which would be myself, just like they had 100 years ago. But I won't dare to say I am as talented as that poet, to which we all celebrate this 100-year anniversary. But as I sat here, I can help but think of Mr. Hale as truly a scientific artist. As you look at this telescope right in front of you, this is truly a work of art. And as I sat here, I thought to myself that this is Mr. Hale's, in a sense, his Sistine Chapel. Adam reaching towards the heavens, touching God's finger, at least trying to. And that's exactly what he did for mankind when he built this telescope. And so he placed mankind at the top of this mountain to reach forward into the great beyond, into the cosmos, into the wonders. So on behalf of Supervisor Captain Barger, I'd like to present this commendation to Mr. Hale at this time.
Probably several dozen docents here who can explain the mechanisms and history of the mountain if you'd like. So please enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a cold night, a long trip up the mountain, but